Welcome everyone to this wonderful event that we're hosting with Dr. Tristen Naylor. He is zooming in live from, was it the National Maritime Museum in Cornwall, where the G7 summit is taking place this weekend. So really exciting times, busy day for him. But to quickly introduce Dr. Naylor, he's a fellow in international relations at the London School of Economics. He was previously a lecturer in the diplomatic studies at the University of Oxford, visiting scholar at Sciences Po Paris. He is also a director of Diplomatic Solutions Limited, where he helps businesses, municipalities, and charities address global challenges such as climate change, pandemic disease, international migration. But best of all, he's on the advisory board of London Politica, which is fantastic. Dr. Naylor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
No, so I just wanted to get started with like a really kind of bird's eye view. What are you seeing in this summit? How is it different from kind of other G7s, G20s that you've been to? And what can we expect this weekend in Cornwall?
Well, it is a profoundly different summit simply by virtue of COVID. It has really changed how this thing is going to work. It's changed the physical layout of the summit. Of course, all of us are walking around with masks. I've taken it off because I can't infect you through the screen. But it certainly feels very, very different. The summit is only just beginning now. The leaders have just formally done their welcome, being welcomed by Prime Minister Johnson, and they now take the family photo, the annual awkward photo, this year in Carbis Bay down on the beach, and are about to head into the first formal session. So things haven't really gotten underway. The first day of the summit is always actually just sort of a lot of waiting around for everybody to fly in, for the delegations to get from the airport to the summit site, and then getting through a lot of the formalities. As for what I'm seeing and observing here, it's first and foremost, it's smaller. Normally, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of journalists from around the world all being here to cover the summit. That's simply not the case. There are very few journalists from overseas who have been accredited to be here. It's almost entirely UK-based media only, and national affiliate based mostly in London. So there are just fewer people about. The layout, I can't show you now, but the layout of sort of where the working rooms are is very different. Lots of plastic perspex screens everywhere, understandably so. As much is taking place outdoor as possible. This being Cornwall, it's overcast, it's drizzling, not the best for conducting business outside. So it is very different. Usually there are big receptions at these things. We're just there aren't this year. So it's an attempt to have an in-person summit, despite the context where being in person is a challenge, to put it politely.
Right. And no, just like the awkward family photo you were talking about, I remember last year, the G20 in Saudi Arabia, very awkward because it made almost entirely digitally. But that sort of you've been writing a lot about that in the last couple of months about diplomacy in a digital era, and the G7 I think is one of the first sort of big tests of that in the sort of a hybrid model that they're kind of adopting this year. So what are you finding with that? What sort of lost and gained in that world of hybrid diplomacy?
Well, you're absolutely right to say that this is really the first real test, certainly at this level of multilateralism, as to whether or not a hybrid model can work. The Indian delegation who was invited are not here owing to COVID concerns. And so when the Indian delegation joins the rest of the invited countries, South Korea, South Africa, and Australia, they'll be coming in via Zoom in the hybrid format. What's lost is all the benefits that one gains from being in person. What's lost is the ability to have just a quiet chat on the margins of the summit, just the ability to go sit down on a table, have a coffee, and try to really overcome the most difficult stumbling blocks in conversations. The real business, the real diplomacy isn't advanced at the summit table. A lot of that's very formulaic, a lot of that's very, it's pre-planned. The real nitty gritty, the real diplomacy, the interesting stuff happens in the sidelines, happens in the back rooms. And when you take away physicality, when you take away the ability to have a quiet chat in the corner, you lose that. You lose the ability to advance towards your foreign policy goals by way of these subtle diplomatic arts. So that's what really concerns me about the move to hybrid diplomacy. Of course, lots is gained. It is more inclusive, or it can be more inclusive. It makes it easier for delegations to participate in meetings, as will be the case for the Indian delegation this year. But it ends up just being, by and large, being very formal, very procedural, and sort of takes away what's special about international summitry. What's the real added value of getting individuals who are at the apex of their political pecking orders together in the same room? You can achieve so much more when you're together with somebody than you can when you're apart. As in all of us, I think, to some extent, have sort of learned over the past year and a half, albeit in very, very different contexts. But simply put, no amount of Zoom calls or FaceTime chats makes up for that very human element of being together with people. And diplomacy is nothing more than just a profoundly human institution internationally.
And I think we saw quite a bit of that sort of human element on the Twitterati today after Biden and Boris took their walk along the beach and had a good sort of 1 hour personal chat. They discussed kind of over 20 topics and came out saying it was an indestructible alliance, a terrific talks, and then sort of so on. What's Biden trying to get out of this coming to the UK? What's his main agenda here?
Well, this is an opportunity both for the new American president and for Prime Minister Johnson to reset the US-UK relationship, a relationship that has been strained, particularly over the past 4 years under the previous administration. And this is a chance to sort of hit the reset button. For the US, for the new American president, for President Biden, this is his first overseas trip. It's his first chance to sort of really kick the tires of Air Force One and take his White House on the road. And he's got some very, very important meetings, not just here at the G7, but certainly hereafter, be it in Brussels, where he heads immediately after, and then on to Switzerland, where he'll have his first in-person meeting with Vladimir Putin. So it's a big, important trip for him. But really, when it comes to the US-UK relationship, it's about hitting the reset button. We saw that both last night as well as this morning, saying that we are renewing the Atlantic Charter. This is a ironclad alliance. Very different language from what we've seen over the past 4 years under the previous administration, where all relationships were conditional on a very sort of tit-for-tat basis.
And that's really interesting as well, because if anything, the last administration, one could argue there's more of an ideological alignment between the two sort of leaders. So that's certainly interesting. And I was looking at some kind of research figures this morning, and one that really struck me was under Trump, 17% of people thought he would do the right thing in world affairs. Under Biden, that number is 75%. Is that what you see reflected when you're bumping shoulders with journalists, with diplomats at the summit?
Definitely. Simply put, Joe Biden is a steady hand. Joe Biden is a seasoned statesperson. He is a seasoned political negotiator, be it not just as President Biden, but previously as Vice President Biden, and certainly as Senator Biden. He was the bedrock of Congress. This is somebody who knows what he's doing. This is somebody who's been in the game for decades and decades and decades. And this is in part one of the leading reasons why the American people decided to throw their weight behind him and vote him into office. This is somebody who is seen as a centrist, moderate, steady, stable hand at the helm, which is exactly what I think most countries in the midst of the current global pandemic certainly need. It's certainly what it seems the American electorate was looking for and it's what they got. And over the past 4 years, certainly at the summit, we had no more than a few moments holding our breath, trying to anticipate exactly what the former American president would do, whether it's storming off in a huff, unsigning the communique, or insulting, well, anybody. There are no concerns about Joseph Biden going off script or doing the unexpected. And this, ideologically, there's an awful lot of overlap between the Democratic Party in the United States and the Conservative Party here in the UK. Both Prime Minister Johnson and President Biden are staunch supporters of the neoliberal economic order, for better or for worse, but they're aligned on that. They both are champions of free and fair trade, something that the previous American administration wasn't so keen on, particularly around tariff barriers. And let's also remember that the climate change agenda is at the very top of both President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson's goals, not just for this summit, but indeed for their premiership writ large. And so again, there's a lot of alignment here. And for the first time in 4 years, some serious progress actually has the potential to be made. And that's no small thing.
And I mean, this sort of reminds me, I had a conversation with sort of a mutual friend of ours, Jonathan, who we interviewed for the podcast, an episode's coming out on Monday. And we were talking about his research in the last month, where he polled lots of people. And what he found was the overwhelming, consensus, the plurality of people think that American soft power, the damage done under President Trump, can't be recovered under President Biden. Does that have an impact in what you're seeing? Is Biden starting from somewhat of sort of a precarious situation, given the legacy of the former administration at the G7 when he talks to other countries?
Well, actually, in a way, I think it actually strengthens President Biden's position. Everybody wants to talk to him. Everybody is clamoring to get their meeting with President Biden. Everybody wants to have their photo with President Biden and start a new relationship with the new administration, and again, reset things to how they were before. So in one way, yes, America's reputation on the world stage has been damaged. It has been diminished, and it is an open question as to whether or not it can recover. Much like Jonathan McClory, I'm not so sure that it can be. I think there's potential for things to get better, but a lot of damage was done. But with respect to this group and these particular individual leaders, when President Biden stepped off Air Force One the other night, I think there was a sigh of relief that it was indeed this particular individual and not one other individual who was walking down those stairs. So yes, sort of in a macro way, America's soft power standing, America's public diplomacy image is diminished, but brand Biden is quite strong.
And I'm going to take this chance really quickly to remind the audience that we're also going to be taking questions sort of in 10-15 minutes. So if you want to drop any of those in the Zoom chat, that would be great. But in the meantime, I mean, a big thing about the G7 dominating all of our headlines in the run-up to the summit was the tax on corporations, the 15% tax, trying to dilute the power of tax havens. Walk me through some of that, and what do those taxes sort of mean?
So this was a landmark agreement that has been years and years and years in the making. And it's basically an agreement amongst the G7 countries that there is a global minimum corporate tax rate, and to tax multinational companies where they do business as opposed to where they are registered. And so very much this is principally aimed at the big tech companies that have found creative ways to lessen their tax burden. This was contentious which is why it took so long to negotiate. But this is my interpretation of why we finally have this now, is not that suddenly we've got a new American administration and things have changed and this can be put through, but rather it's the pandemic that has made this a necessity. Basically, public purses have been stretched way beyond their limits. Treasuries are desperately needing to increase their tax revenue. And so now is the time to get this sort of agreement through. And all 7 have signed up for it at the ministerial level. I'd expect that the leaders will endorse it this weekend. And then the big question is, well, what will the G20 do? The G7 is an important step, but this is really only going to work in a substantive fashion if the G20 signs up for it as well. And that is another hard round of negotiations that these countries will have to go through to get that. But nonetheless, I don't want to rain on that parade too much. This is a big historic agreement.
Yeah. And, I mean, the one thing I found a little bit odd about it was when it came out a couple of days ago, if you're watching the markets, nothing really changed that much. Investors didn't really seem to be that spooked, which kind of, might give me the impression that they're not maybe expecting these taxes to be as effective as they might sound right now. It might just be sort of more of a haircut when it actually comes down to implementation. Certainly as well, because, the way these sort of taxes work, they really need, global consensus in the way that they're implemented. Otherwise, countries can really just go to whatever jurisdiction isn't in alignment with these, even if the G7 countries agree to it. So, I mean, in terms of, implementation, what we can actually end up seeing, are you optimistic about that?
I am. It's going to take time. With respect to market reaction, I think a lot of it was already priced in. I think what is spooking investors right now is the prospect of inflation, and it's sort of on the inflationary front. That's where we're going to be seeing market fluctuation, and particularly in the downward direction, but not that severely. I think that's pretty much priced in now as well. In terms of implementation, we are talking about, at a minimum, 7 different legislatures that now need to ratify this agreement. That's going to take time. And so even if this gets its formal blessing from the G7 leaders, which I think it will, we're still looking at least a couple of years before this is a robust tax regime that is in operation. So it may also be that it's so far in the future that markets aren't that spooked about it, because, well, The future is the future.
No, fair. And, another big kind of priority on the agenda this year is climate. And that's certainly even more important in the sort of lead up to the COP26 summit in Glasgow, also happening this year. So, I mean, what's sort of the progress on that? Can we expect to see any kind of very landmark agreements around that? Or is it going to be sort of more of a continuation of the status quo Paris Agreement type stuff? Yeah.
This is the theme of the summit. COVID and universal vaccination has sort of become understandably so, the topic of the day, but it was always intended by the host government that this summit was going to be fundamentally about climate change and the planet's future. In no small part, that's why Cornwall was chosen as a site. Cornwall being a place that is quite progressive in terms of its investment in renewable energy, quite progressive in terms of initiatives in place to reduce negative environmental impact from everything from transportation to mining to any industrial activity whatsoever. I mean, this particular venue, I've got nothing but wind-powered boats around me. This is meant to be a green, carbon neutral summit, which I'm not so sure that it is, but that's another story. So yeah, it's all about the environment. The British Prime Minister sees this very much as the key stepping stone to the Conference of Parties, COP26, later this year in November, which he as well will be hosting. And so what I think we're going to see is some major groundwork laid to advance to an even more ambitious agreement than Paris. Already we've seen, for example, all 7 G7 members committing to getting to net zero emissions by 2030. So increasing their ambition from it being net zero by 2050 that's a big move. I think we're going to see more big moves much like that. I mean, quite significantly, Australia has been invited this year. Australia is the one country at the G7 that has not agreed to increase their the ambition of their commitment to net zero. I would imagine on the sidelines of the summit, a number of leaders will be pressing Scott Morrison to join them in committing to net zero by 2030.
Yeah, and among kind of these sort of big priorities, climate, COVID primarily, I think one of the things that sort of gets lost, which is very important, is the infrastructure aspect of it. I think with every foreign policy move that Biden's involved in, there's going to necessarily be a China angle to it. And a large part of what he's trying to strike with the Europeans, I think, is some sort of viable alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road project, which has long been needed, I think, just given how far the Chinese have been in that race for the last decade or so. So are we going to see any progress on that, do you think?
I'm not so sure we're going to see really noteworthy progress on that front. I think when it comes to countering, or at least making maneuvers in response to the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of the work that needs to now be done is, and this goes back to what we were speaking about before, undoing a lot of the damage that has been done over the past 4 years, a lot of the difficulties in bilateral relationship amongst these members of the club. And so even if the American president is able to just sort of ratchet things back to the way they were before, that will be progress. But getting beyond what had been the status quo, I'm not so sure we're going to see anything, at least at this summit. But to go to the front end of your question, China is very much sort of the elephant not in this room, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about global economic order, whether we're talking about pandemic preparedness. China fits into every discussion in some way. And it's important to remember, again, who's invited this year. In addition to the 7, we've got Australia and South Korea here, for whom China is a particular concern.
Yeah, and sort of these other countries that are invited into the summit that are, tuning in virtually. I mean, what goes into the decision-making process of who's invited and who's left out? Because I know that's a key part of your work with social.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting question, and I mean the short answer is that it's just really up to the host leader. G7 summits are quite curious things in international affairs writ large, in that it really is one of the last vestiges of personal diplomacy at the leaders level. And it's very much a leader-driven process then, where the leader says, this is what I want this summit to be about. This is my summit, and I want it to be about climate change, or I want it to be about COVID or economic development or whatever. They set the priorities, and coming off the back of those priorities, in this case, Prime Minister says, and these are the people that I want to add to the table. These are the people who I want to come to this, be a part of this discussion. What I think is really interesting, and I think really, really significant about this particular G7 summit, is that the British Prime Minister has chosen to invite 4 democracies, again, India, South Africa, South Korea, and Australia. What I think he's doing here is very much trying to articulate a new identity, a new vision, indeed a new purpose for what the G7 is, and trying to articulate it around democracy and this idea that this is a democratic club. This is the club that is the force for democratic protection and democratic promotion on the world stage, which I think is quite interesting. Whether or not that'll work or not, whether or not that's a good thing, whether or not the world needs that, is another discussion. But I think it's really interesting. It's the first time since the global financial crisis and the elevation of the G20 to the leaders level, where the G7 sort of began to slip into, maybe not irrelevance, but in many ways redundancy. This is the first deliberate attempt to really articulate a new vision for what the G7 could be. And it's very much this idea, almost sort of like a league of democracies, which of course, historically has not gone terribly well.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I mean, I'll ask one sort of last question before I open up to the audience, but while we're talking about sort of defining a new vision for the G7, I think one of Boris Johnson's large priorities is defining a new vision for the UK in a kind of post-Brexit context. We saw the sort of British foreign policy review and the defense review come up with an Indo-Pacific tilt. Chatham House suggested earlier that the UK should play the role of a global broker, and it's certainly hosting the G7 is a large part of that. So what are Boris's large priorities for what he wants the UK to be and where he wants it to be in the next 2 years, and how does the G7 kind of play into that?
Well, I think that this is Prime Minister Johnson's best bet to redefine what his premiership is all about. He came to office, obviously, very much as the Brexit Prime Minister. That was overtaken by the pandemic. He is the COVID Prime Minister. This is a chance now to say Brexit and COVID, if not behind us, or at least nearing our rearview mirror, figuratively. This is about the future, and this is about beginning to set his legacy. And I think this is sort of maybe not his last chance, but probably his best chance to really articulate what that legacy is going to be. And again, I think he's at least trying to make it about the environment, make it about climate change, which is why he's made it the priority and is going sort of full tilt with it as the priority. Whether or not he'll succeed, whether or not his premiership will be about anything but Brexit and COVID remains to be seen. I'm not so sure that he's going to be able to dig in his way out of that and be known as anything but the Brexit and the COVID Prime Minister. But this is the attempt. This is the chance.
No, fascinating. Great. Well, I'll open up to sort of audience questions now. So yeah, if you have a question, just use the raise hand option on Zoom, or you could just send it through on the chat and I can ask it for you. But yeah, we'll give that like 30 seconds. And actually, while sort of the questions just started to filter in, I'm assuming this would have been one of the questions anyway, which is, the vaccine front. We've seen, the U.S. make sort of a very large commitment in the last week to donate high degree of quantities to developing countries, 75% to COVAX. Are we seeing that that trend? Is that gonna is the G7 finally gonna live up to sort of what its role should have been in kind of leading the sort of global effort of vaccinating all the countries, despite all the constant calls of we're not safe until we're all safe?
Well, they're certainly going to try. This G7 will very much be, in no small part, a game of the different leaders trying to outdo one another and donate more vaccine or more money. But already we're beginning to see problems in the way that it's going about. There's one quibble over whether or not what matters is the amount of money spent versus the number of vaccines that are distributed. Some countries are counting number of vaccines, others are counting contribution in dollar or pound terms. Then there's also the question of capacity, whether or not the countries to whom the vaccines are intended have the absorptive capacity to actually do what needs to be done with them. So we need to also be thinking about the global vaccine rollout, not just in terms of the number of vaccines that are going out or how much this country or that country intends to support the initiative, but also, well, can this actually work? Can we roll this plan out? Or are we looking at wasted money, wasted effort, and wasted vaccines? And that just, or at least not that I've seen over the past couple of days here, that hasn't featured as much as just sort of the big banner headline, we're donating 500 million vaccines, or we're donating this much money or whatnot. And so my certain hope, certainly my hope is that the leaders in their meeting are going to talk about sort of the nitty gritty details of how they actually deliver on this. And so all this to say, yeah, this is the headline. This is sort of the big thrust of the summit so far, anyway. But we've still got a long way to go to see if this is actually going to be substantive, and can actually, you know, make good on some big promises. And then just very quickly, the second thing I want to say on that is that I think it's also, I see a worrying danger of a sort of first world, third world narrative coming up, you know, sort of, for lack of a better term, a sort of white savior type complex at play here. And I think the G7 needs to be really careful not to be tarring itself with that brush and being seen to be in this sort of benevolent first world sort of image. This is where partnership with other countries really comes into play.
No, brilliant. I think that leads really well into the sort of first question we have from Jack Ulster, who asked, you know, why is the G7 relevant when it seems to just include traditional Western countries or, you know, largely US partners? And I'd sort of add to that, what can the G7 do to be more relevant?
Well, this is a great question. Exactly as I was saying before, certainly since the global financial crisis, the G7 has been really quite listless. It's not really had the defined, clear purpose and identity that it had, not just before the global financial crisis, but even going all the way back to its early years in the mid-1970s. The G7 countries are no longer the world's largest economies by any stretch of the imagination. But what they are, what they continue to be is, well, maybe not the largest, but nonetheless, very significant, very rich, wealthy, advanced industrialized economies. And that matters. But then second, and again, this speaks to the point of Prime Minister Johnson's invitation list, they are a club of democracies. And maybe that's what is unique. That could be the relevance of the G7 today, sort of the bastion of democracy. And again, I don't want to get into sort of the debate of whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it seems to me that to the extent that the club is trying to find a unique added value for itself in the world, it seems to be that.
Mm. And Alessandra asked, can you shed light on how well the UK has been working with Italy, the current G20 president?
So there's always a bit of discussion between the G7 and the G20 chair. Interestingly, there's no formal relationship between the G7 and G20 chair. So there's, you know, there can be some friction, some overlap there. But Italy is a fully paid up, full member of the G7. The new Italian head of government, Mario Draghi, is here. He'll be articulating to his G7 partners what he intends for his G20 to be all about. I think it'll also be predominantly about climate change and COVID. And so even if there isn't a lot of formal coordination between these two host governments, they're very much aligned in terms of what their interests are and very much in lockstep in terms of what they perceive to be the big issues of the day.
Mm. And I'll hand it over to sort of Alex now, who has his hand up for a question.
Hi, Dr. Naylor. Thank you for your time. I just had a quick question. If you could shed light on the reports of some, diplomatic disagreements between the U.S. and the U.K. regarding the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement. I read a couple articles that the Biden administration was pressuring the PM Johnson to comply with the agreement, and I just wanted to see: is this going to be a significant source of disagreements? Is this a minor issue? Just want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That particularly colored coverage of Prime Minister Johnson and President Biden's meetings, particularly this morning. President Biden is not alone in articulating quite forcefully that the Good Friday Agreement is sacrosanct and cannot be touched. There are questions as to how committed the current British government is to leaving the Good Friday Agreement in place in every detail and in every way. And I don't want to sort of get into sort of a speculative exploration of the degree to which that's true or not. But what I can say is that I think it's really interesting that President Biden has chosen to make that one of the key themes of sort of the opening round of meetings here. And this is in part owing to his own Irish heritage. President Biden has always been an ardent supporter of the Good Friday Agreement. And he's very much alive with his European partners here. The French president, the German chancellor has all said much the same, that the Good Friday Agreement is sort of sacrosanct. At a minimum, this does place pressure on the British government, the British Prime Minister in particular, to come out and say, I'm not going to touch this. We will be true to our word. And I'd imagine that the story probably won't carry on past today. I kind of think sort of the media strategy around this would be, okay, this is the opening salvo. This is when we're going to be able to hit hardest and make it quite clear what our red lines are around any negotiations, particularly in terms of any new trade agreement between the US and the UK. And I mean, President Biden personally is quite passionate about the Good Friday Agreement, but the United States in general, the US foreign policy in general, is quite interested in a new US-UK trade agreement, as is the United Kingdom trying to find a new post-Brexit trade agreement. And so I very much interpret what President Biden has been saying is, look, if you're not going to stay true on the Good Friday Agreement, then we can't even begin to be talking about international trade.
Mm-hmm. I'll hand over to Kokotsi for the next question.
Hi, Tristen. How are you? Nice to see you.
Very well. Nice to see you.
Miss being there with you, but hopefully in Italy for the G20. Great comments. Wonderful to get your perspective being on site this year. Question on Russia. Now, one of Joe Biden's aims at Cornwall is to show Western solidarity before his forthcoming meeting with Vladimir Putin in Geneva, as you referenced. I'm wondering, what do you expect the G7 will signal in their final with regards to Russia, if anything at all?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. This is certainly for Joe Biden in the near term. This is the stepping stone to the big meeting in Switzerland, which in some ways sort of diminishes what the G7 means, or it means something different to him than it does to Prime Minister Johnson. What I expect we're going to see is a firm statement about democratic solidarity. I think we're very likely to see language both on Belarus and on Ukraine in the communique. I don't expect it will be too detailed in terms of what they say, other than just to recommit to the protection of democracy and remind other countries to respect the democratic wishes of others.
I'm just a little follow-up to that as well. I mean, one of the things we thought about in the last week is, Putin outlawed the opposition group led by Alexei Navalny. Do you think there will be a special kind of mention of that when, Biden speaks to Putin?
Yes, definitely. Without question. Whether or not that's going to be specifically articulated here at the G7 and articulated in the communique, I'm not so certain. I don't want to say no, but again, I don't want to overstep in speculating too wildly. But without question, that will feature in their discussion in a few days' time. Without question.
And I also just wanted to Jenny's question. She asked, how will multinationals be affected by the G7 tax deal?
Well, much like we were saying before, I'm not sure there's going to be much of an effect, certainly not much of a market effect. I think this has been sort of priced in. It will be more difficult to engage in sort of tax arbitrage and move about. But I don't. This is a landmark agreement, but I'm not sure it's going to really change things in any sort of dramatic fashion. And maybe I'm too much of a pessimist. Maybe, I don't know, maybe this is sort of some radical movement that is going to, I don't know, stifle the progress and innovation forever or something. But I don't think so. I think it's a big important move, but I don't think it's going to change much from what we observe today.
Mm-hmm. And so another follow-up to that, just personally as well, is we often, the UK is a big kind of actor when it comes to tax havens. I mean, lots of tax havens, like Cayman Islands, they're British overseas territories often. So, I mean, traditionally, it's been, very kind of like strategically ambiguous, let's say, about how it's countries. But with this sort of taxes, is there like a real fundamental policy shift in that, or is that just kind of an
I think it's a really, really interesting question. I think one thing that I found fascinating about the Tory government policy with respect to tax havens is actually, even going back as far as David Cameron, they've really been one of the leaders in talking about the elimination of tax havens. There are a few different ways to interpret this. One is that they meaningfully want to stamp them out. Sort of naturally skeptical me is sort of on the fence about whether or not that's true. But again, I don't want to get too speculative. Another way to interpret this is, look, if the British government isn't going to be the one to stamp them out, then who is? It's sort of a only Nixon could go to China type argument that it's the country that has historically enabled some of the most significant tax havens that ought to be the one who can lead the charge to shut them down. I don't want to speculate too much, but I do actually think it is quite interesting, at a minimum, to note that the UK is one of the leaders on trying to push back against tax havens.
No, perfect. I mean, you have a very busy day ahead of you. So before we close out, I just ask you one last question. I mean, with all the chatter around the G7, is there one particular thing that kind of stands out to you that you think is being left out of the conversation? Otherwise, that's you feel is important to be highlighted.
So I think that this year in particular, because this is taking place amidst COVID, because this is the very first chance that the leaders have had to meet in person since the pandemic began, I think that that's something we should certainly I'm paying attention to. I think we should all be paying attention to as well. How is diplomacy going to work in this sort of context? And this actually goes back to one of your early questions about the idea of hybrid diplomacy or hybrid diplomacy. And so we're talking a lot about COVID. We're talking a lot about vaccines. We're talking about sort of the obvious issues at play in a global health crisis, and we should be. But particularly if for observers of international politics, for scholars of international relations, we should be thinking about sort of the mechanics of personal diplomacy between leaders. We should be thinking about the mechanics of summitry and whether or not this still can work. Socially distanced, wearing masks, with certain delegations having to zoom in. And this is a test. I don't know. Maybe it does work. Maybe everything's going to be fine. I'm not so sure that it is. But again, maybe I'm too pessimistic. But I think what we really ought to be paying attention to is whether or not this works. And I think the discussion with India tomorrow will be really key. Is India meaningfully around the table in the same way that the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and Japan and Italy and all else are? Or are they not just second tier sort of invitees, but sort of third tier because they didn't even get into the room to begin with? How does that play out? Is that fair? And it remains to be seen. I really don't know. I have my suspicions, but I don't know.
No, brilliant. Dr. Tristen Naylor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us in your very, very busy weekend. And especially, I mean, we always sort of talk to experts from kind of around the world about, the issues that they're passionate about, but to really be, albeit virtually with you at the G7 and get your kind of insider perspective on this is super cool. So thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Naylor. And yes, speak soon. Take care, everyone.